In music, chords are often understood as having a function, meaning their position in a harmonic progression implies a specific role within a larger structure. With that said, it's not always useful to think of harmony as purely functional. Instead, we may benefit from using chords as a sort of palette of colors used to evoke emotional associations. In a more literal sense, painters may select warm colors to portray a bright, high energy atmosphere that seems welcoming, or cool colors for a more dim, low energy environment that is soothing, ambiguous, and at times uneasy. For visual artists, this is one small part of what's known as color theory. Musicians think about chords in a similar way using what's known as chord quality, which places chords in separate classes based on their characteristic sound. So with this approach in mind, here are 5 chords that you can use in your writing process for an uneasy or dramatic effect. For each example, we'll discuss the emotional associations that come with their characteristic sounds. We'll also closely examine the intervals that construct these chords and explore how rearranging the intervals impacts that characteristic sound. Lastly, I'll present melodic and harmonic use cases using original examples. Each example will get its own dedicated video, making this a 5-part lecture series. The first chord I've included is the half-diminished chord. This chord is constructed of 2 minor thirds and a major third. From the root, there is a minor third, a tritone, and a minor seventh. The first 3 pitches in this chord, C, E flat, and G flat, construct a diminished triad, meaning half-diminished seventh chords are a diminished triad with a minor seventh. Alternatively, you could view this chord as having 2 sides, a less stable side and a more stable side. On the less stable side, we have the previously mentioned C diminished chord, with an unstable tritone between C and G flat. On the more stable side, there's an E flat minor triad with a stable fifth between E flat and B flat. So in terms of chord quality, what do these observations tell us about the half-diminished seventh chord? Well, on one hand, the C diminished side produces a more tense, volatile sound that evokes an eerie sense of a kind of foreboding unease. On the other hand, the E-flat minor side is less volatile, perhaps more soothing and certainly less foreboding. When these 2 sounds are put together, we're left with a chord that evokes a sense of uneasiness that points to a feeling of mystery. It's uneasy but not volatile, tense but not too tense. In general, it just feels sort of ambiguous. Finally, let's explore technical examples to use in your writing process. We'll start with vertical structures. The first idea that comes to mind is a root position arpeggio. This could represent a particular moment in time, a mysterious event, or revelation of a mystery. You could use this as an opening phrase to set the scene of your composition. Inversion techniques can also be used to make the harmony sound more or less stable, without adding or removing pitches. As a generic rule, closed voicings will have a richer texture with less stability, while open voicings produce a smoother texture with more stability. Additionally, the chord can be voiced in a way that emphasizes the more stable intervals. For example, using the fifth between E flat and B flat as a foundation for your voicing will produce more stability. You could also double the E flat to create a power chord as the basis for the rest of your voicing. Fifths and octaves are the most stable intervals in equal temperament, so using this as a foundation for the rest of your voicing will give the sound even greater stability. Another approach is to voice the chord in a manner that keeps the most dissonant interval, like the tritone, far apart. In this example, all 3 of these techniques are used. For a less stable sound, try using closed voicings and experiment with voicing tritones in the bass or voice multiple tritones within the entire structure. This example uses all 3 of those techniques. Naturally, the half-diminished chord can also function as the basis for melodic structures. Here is a generic example of the chord in root position, ascending and descending. The brackets show each half-diminished chord repeating at the octave. In general, melodic patterns can be varied by starting and ending on different pitches, alternating between neighboring pitches, or skipping a pitch within the natural order of an ascending or descending pattern. Let's take a look at 2 examples. This example features a gestural quicksilver motive that employs the first 2 melodic techniques I mentioned. In this example, I use skips between notes that naturally occur in this chord group, more specifically octaves, fourths, and seventh leaps. For even more melodic variability, you can use the half-diminished scale. The chord we're discussing here is built on C, so naturally we'll build the scale on C. You can think of this scale as an altered natural minor scale, where the fifth scale degree is lowered by half step. Some call this Aeolian flat 5. With a flat 5, the scale is given an additional tritone, thus making it comparatively darker in quality. With this scale, the previously mentioned techniques can be applied to create more intricate melodic material that allows for greater harmonic variation. This figure shows pitches from the half-diminished chord, labeled in red, while the pitches unique to the half-diminished scale appear in blue. This distinction demonstrates how pitches that are unique to the scale can add more harmonic variation. Lastly, let's observe a short musical passage that uses every example I've discussed so far. Now that we've listened, let's break it down. The first thing we hear in this passage is a low C followed by a root position arpeggio. Because half-diminished chords have a more ambiguous tonality, the low C is used to reinforce the root of the chord. This phrase also sets the tone for the sounds that will be used later, that being the notes from the C half-diminished 7th chord and that of the half-diminished scale. In fact, the very next phrase contains a segment of the half-diminished scale, starting on G flat and ending on C. Instead of studying the exact interval patterns here, I think it's more helpful to think more fundamentally about what's happening. In a basic sense, a melody is a combination of steps and leaps. I simply use the scale as a guideline and explored different combinations of steps and leaps, and went with the ones that I liked, and I encourage you to do the same in your writing process. Moving on, this bass melody resolves to A flat, which supports octave Cs and treble clef. This is a cadential moment in the piece that implies A flat major, and is made possible using notes from the half-diminished scale. Following this cadence is more melodic material. This phrase is entirely constructed using the half-diminished chord, with the exception of one pitch. Starting at the high C, it arpeggiates downward the span of 2 octaves and ascends back up the span of 1 octave. Next, alternating neighbor tones between B flat, C, and D are used, where D is the only note in this passage that comes from the half-diminished scale. The idea here is to use a pitch to highlight a particular moment within this phrase before returning back to the half-diminished chord that descends down to B flat in the next measure. To summarize, this excerpt is an arpeggiation of the half-diminished chord with an added pitch for variation. In the next measure, the 2 lower voices from the scale move in parallel, a third or 10th apart. In general, writing melodic patterns in thirds is a reliable technique that can produce more stability. In the higher register, a spread voicing is used to create more width and fullness. Placing this chord in the same register of the melody may obscure the melody, so for that reason the chord was placed in a higher register. Moving on, this measure uses only the pitches from the half-diminished chord. In the bass, there's an ascending third inversion half-diminished chord, starting and ending on B flat. In the treble clef, inversions of this chord are descending, creating contrary motion relative to the bass. Starting in second inversion, the highest note of each beat is lowered an octave in the next, until landing on second inversion once again. In the final moments of this passage, B flat is sound in the bass. Here, the stable side of the half-diminished chord is used to prepare a strong cadence by resolving the B flat down to E flat. Both fourths and fifths are useful as they have a strong tonal polarity that point to a sense of finality for cadential moments at the end of a musical phrase. For added stability, the E flat is placed in octaves, providing a strong foundation for the second inversion half-diminished chord in treble clef. So that's it for this lecture. If you learned something new, please consider subscribing and stay tuned for part 2.